Good afternoon, and welcome to the Public Safety and Government Operations Committee meeting. In attendance today, we have President Nick Mosby. We have myself, Chair of the Committee, Mark Conway, representing the 4th District, Councilman Burnett, representing the 8th District, Councilman Cohen, representing the 1st District, Councilman Costello, representing the 11th District, Councilwoman Porter, representing the 10th District, and Councilwoman Ramos, representing the 14th District. Representing the Office of the President, I've got Tiffany Macklin in the back and Preston Lewis up front. And representing the Mayor's Office, I've got Nina Themelis and, of course, our City Administrator. This afternoon, the committee will have a hearing on Council Resolution LO 2023-0039, oversight hearing, Brooklyn mass shooting, for the purpose of inviting representatives of the Baltimore Police Department, the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, the Housing Authority of Baltimore City, and the Department of Transportation to discuss the mass shooting that occurred in Brooklyn on July 2nd, 2023. This bill was sponsored by Councilmember Porter and myself. And I want to start out by first asking that folks be respectful to each other during this hearing. I think it's really important that we have an honest and productive discussion. So we're reconvening this oversight hearing following the release of after-action reports completed by 4 city agencies on the Brooklyn Homes mass shooting on July 2nd, which tragically cut short the lives of 2 young people, including Aaliyah Gonzalez, whose mother and family is here with us today. Ms. Gonzalez, would you please stand? Thank you. To the victims of the shooting, their families, and the Brooklyn community who have been injured and traumatized, we're here to support you and lift you up. In the days, weeks, and months following the tragedy, we learned deeply concerning information about the response to this gathering by our city agencies. And I'm glad to see that the mayor accepted the suggestion from this committee to have all agencies involved, and not just BPD, prepare after-action reports. Those reports showed missed opportunities by multiple agencies who were aware or should have been aware of the Brooklyn Day event before it began, and especially as it was happening. Ultimately, those failures led to Baltimore's worst mass shooting in recent history. This afternoon, we will hear from the Baltimore Police Department, the Housing Authority, the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, the Baltimore City Fire Department, and the Office of Emergency Management. And while we cannot turn back time, I'm interested in hearing blunt reflections on the deficiencies in agencies' responses and tangible, measurable improvements that agencies are committed to making. I know my colleagues and I all had questions following the shooting that we were unable to answer during our first hearing, and I hope that we are in a better place now to answer these questions today than we were 2 months ago. I want to make one thing clear. This event does not define us. It does not define our community or our city. We're a city of dreamers. We're a city of believers. And this pain does not box us in or shut us down. Rather, it should light a fire beneath us and within us to want to be better for each other. We want to be able to come together and host events in our communities without fear, and we should be able to. That's what makes us a thriving city. And we want all of our residents to believe in what we can be when we strive to be better together. So with that, the order of events today, we're going to start off with testimony from folks in the public. This report has now been out there for a few weeks, and I want to encourage folks to provide insight and feedback so that our agencies can speak to what they're doing to address the issues brought forward in the report. After we hear from the public, I'll turn it over to the agencies, and they'll talk us through their findings. So with that, any public testimony? So I don't have anyone that is signed up. If there is anyone here now in public, in person, that would like to speak, you are absolutely welcome to. If you are joining us virtually, please use the raise hand function, and we will unmute you and offer the opportunity for you to speak. Okay. Seeing no testimony at the moment, we will jump into presentations with the agencies, starting with Commissioner Worley.
So I'll kick us off, and then I'll turn it over to the agencies.
Thank you, Madam.
Yes. All right. You're still going to be up first, Commissioner.
Okay.
All right. Good afternoon, Chairman Conway, Council President Mosby, members of the committee, and council staff. For the record, I am Faith P. Leach, Chief Administrative Officer for the City of Baltimore. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today on Council Bill 023-0039, Oversight Hearing on the Brooklyn Mass Shooting Incident. Before I go into my formal testimony, I want to hold space for the residents of Brooklyn Homes, as well as each of the victims, their friends, and family members whose lives have been forever changed by this horrific tragedy. 18-year-old Aaliyah Gonzalez and 20-year-old Khalees Fagbemi were killed, and 28 others were injured in the largest scale mass shooting incident in this city's history. Council members, there isn't a day that goes by that I don't think of this community. Like many of you, my heart aches for Brooklyn, especially for the dozens of children, the young men and the young women with so much passion and so much promise that call Brooklyn Homes home. They will forever be impacted by this tragedy. Our city will be forever impacted by this tragedy. But we can and we must forge a positive path forward for the Brooklyn community, and that starts with taking accountability. Today you will hear the unabashed truth. You will hear pure facts on our actions, and yes, in some cases, inaction in the events leading up to the Brooklyn Homes mass shooting incident. As you all are aware, Mayor Scott directed 4 city agencies, the Baltimore Police Department, the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, the Baltimore City Fire Department, and the Office of Emergency Management, as well as 1 independent agency, the Housing Authority of Baltimore, to develop after-action reports following the July 2nd, 2023 mass shooting incident that took place in the Brooklyn Homes community. The administration's purpose in directing relevant agencies to immediately develop after-action reports was threefold. 1, we wanted agencies to provide an immediate internal assessment of each agency's response to the Brooklyn Homes mass shooting incident and review the timeline of events leading up to and following the incident. 2, identify strengths, weaknesses, and perceived system breakdowns that we could address. 3, provide lessons learned, identify best practices, and recommend changes to policies, procedures, and protocols. As the city administrator, I convene weekly AAR or after-action report check-in meetings over a period of approximately 6 to 8 weeks with agency leaders to review the AAR reports from other mass shooting incidents, including but not limited to the 2016 Pulse nightclub mass shooting incident and the 2017 Las Vegas mass shooting incident. These mass shooting incident reports took between 18 months and 2 years to complete. Today, agency leaders will present the findings and recommendations outlined in each of their respective after-action reports. Agencies will present in the following order. The Baltimore Police Department will be first, followed by the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. I am sitting in for Interim Director Mavronis. The Housing Authority of Baltimore and the Baltimore City Fire Department and Office of Emergency Management will be presented together. Now, I will turn it over to BPD.
Thank you, Chief Leach. Good morning or good afternoon, members of the council. I'm Acting Commissioner Rich Worley. I'm going to give some brief statements, then I'm going to turn it over to different members of my team to go over the report for different parts of it. This is actually personal to me. I grew up in Baltimore. I lived in Brooklyn for 12 years, 2 blocks from where the incident occurred. So some of those people I'm sure I've seen in the neighborhood, some of them that I've seen since, I got to know a little bit. But within 24 hours of the incident, BPD launched a comprehensive review of what happened and why. We needed to get to the bottom of why we didn't do better, why we couldn't do better. We know we made mistakes, and we know we could have done much better that day and that night. It was all throughout the day we had a chance to react. It's important that our after-action report not only points out what we didn't do, but also gives us recommendations to how to fix it moving forward. We have to fix what went wrong so that we can never have something like this happen again. We must ensure better responses and strengthen our relationships with our communities to ensure that this never happens again in any community in Baltimore. We uncovered actions of a few personnel who, after the shooting, behaved heroically, and we will address that at a different time. But this report was just the first step in the process, and it's a continuing report. It's not the end of the report. We'll continue to investigate additional information as we move through the internal part of the investigation and as things come forward from those interviews. We'll continue. Our goal is to make the department better, and the only way we do that is by the very first hearing I stood up here and said we know we did things wrong and we could have done things much better. This is going to give you a more comprehensive review of what happened during the timeline during that day and leading up to that day. At the same time, our detectives continue to work around the clock on a criminal investigation, of which today another young man was charged, a 15-year-old was charged with 44 counts in relation to the murders and the shootings. He is the fifth of hopefully many more that will come that we will be able to hold accountable, and it's a continuing investigation that our men and women are doing around the clock. But before I go into the presentation, I just want to say BPD can and will do better. We've already made some changes. We'll continue to make changes to make sure this doesn't happen again and that we're better prepared when these events occur. With that said, I'll turn it over to Deputy Commissioner Eric Melancon to go through the slides.
Good afternoon. I'm Eric Melancon. I'm the Deputy Commissioner of the Compliance Bureau for the Baltimore Police Department. Before I begin my presentation, I did want to take a moment to share some personal news that I will be leaving the BPD in the coming weeks. I've submitted my resignation from the department. My last working day will be the end of this month. I'll be returning home to New Orleans to be closer to family and to pursue a new career opportunity. I've spent 4.5 years in executive leadership roles here at the BPD, and it's been an honor and a privilege to serve the members of this department and the residents of Baltimore. I want to thank former Commissioner Michael Harrison for appointing me as his Chief of Staff and then promoting me to Deputy Commissioner, granting me the opportunity to serve as a transformational force in reforming the BPD. I want to thank Acting Commissioner Worley for continuing to place his trust in me in serving in this role and as the lead architect of this after-action effort. I want to thank Judge James Berdar, our federal judge, in charge of overseeing our consent decree for his confidence and support over these past 4.5 years. And I want to thank the leadership team of the Compliance Bureau with whom I've had the honor to lead for this past year. Chief Derek Canton, Major Kim Greenidge, Major Steve Homan, Major Derek Loeffler, Director Shannon Sullivan, Director Leslie Blyther, Director Gary Cordner, Director Beth Hart, Captain Tashana Brown, Captain Arnold Jenkins, Captain Valencia Carter, Captain Fred Stewart, and Deputy Director Melissa Kravchuk. I mentioned these names because they were instrumental in the development of this report. This team, this world-class team, developed this report and produced it so that it could be released in record time. The work that they do and the men and women that they oversee in the Compliance Bureau do a tremendous job in ensuring that the BPD continues to demonstrate that it can serve as a national model for being a self-assessing, self-correcting, and transparent law enforcement agency. It was important for me, personally, as Deputy Commissioner of Compliance, to ensure that a comprehensive review of this incident was completed by my Bureau prior to my departure. I'll now go through the methodology of our report. Next slide. As the Acting Commissioner mentioned, on the day after this event, he directed my Bureau to produce an after-action report in accordance with our policies. Our policies are typically surrounding uses of force or police-involved shootings, but any critical incident can be referred to the PRB, and in doing so, part of our requirement is to ensure that we are looking for ways to improve the department. Our comprehensive review has done that, and we will go over that with the timeline of the events that we've uncovered and recommendations on how we can improve. Our lead questions into this: what were the planning, staffing, and deployment preparations in the Southern District of the day of the event, what information was known by Intel or other neighborhood units about the Brooklyn Day events, what calls for service or body-worn camera or CCTV information is there, and what was the quality of our response to the scene overall. Next slide. Everything I'm about to provide in the next few slides are all part of the published report that has been online. My goal in this presentation is to highlight some of the key findings, and so as we go through these, if the members here have any questions, we're happy to entertain those after the presentations are completed. On June 28th, the first instance of a piece of intel, and the only piece of intel prior to the event, was collected at about 1 o'clock from the open source unit. A social media post that referred to Brooklyn Saturday was found, but then later was removed and disappeared, and they were unable to find it again. There was no indication, however, of any follow-up on that intel request to create any kind of preparation. July 1st, from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m., Brooklyn Day event organizers and vendors began arriving in and around the 800 block of Gretna Court. The event is advertised to begin at 5 p.m. based on flyers we've obtained, but there was no endpoint defined. Next slide. From 5 to 7, crowds began to form. Brooklyn Day events commence. At this point, there's between 400 to 500 folks who are observed on CCTV cameras, and we've also had indications that CCTV cameras are being manually operated by BPD personnel. However, there's no effort made to notify supervisors from the CCTV folks until later in the evening. July 1st, 6:57 p.m., there's a call for service regarding a disorderly incident at a location near 10th and Renwick Court. The caller reports that it's Brooklyn Day, and 2 vehicles are driving recklessly at the location. And according to a review of the audio transcript, it's Brooklyn Day is not read out to the responding officer. However, that information would have been available via their mobile data terminal, their computer in their car, were they able to look it up. Next slide. July 1st, 9:41 p.m. It's a call for service for an armed person. The complainant states that there are hundreds of males and females armed with guns and knives at the location. This call, however, is not assigned for a response until 10:14 p.m., approximately 30 minutes after the call came in. A subsequent radio transmission by an officer in response to this call is made. We may have to redirect that call to the National Guard then. That comment has been referred to Public Integrity for an Internal Affairs investigation for inappropriate comment. 10:37 p.m., Foxtrot flyover. Foxtrot, for those not familiar, is the aviation unit, our helicopter support unit. They estimate 700 people at the location at that point and communicates this to the supervisor, who then asks, "We've got a call for discharging in the area. Anything looks suspicious?" They respond, "No, negative. Everything appears to be normal now." The call is then later dispositioned as no police action needed. Next slide. From 10:30 to 10:37 p.m., there is a Evertel group. This is our internal means of communication, formal means of communication amongst different groups within our department. This is the Southern District command thread. The sergeant posts at 10:30, just a heads up for midnight shift. Looks like the citizens of Brooklyn snuck in Brooklyn Day on us. There are roughly 800 to 900 people in the homes. Captain replies at 10:59, appreciate it. Anyone that wants some OT tonight, the checkbook is open. Later at 11:12 p.m., this is after the shift has now changed from the evening shift to the night shift. Captain advises to do a check of Brooklyn homes first thing. If resources are needed, please advise. The lieutenant copies, and then later posts that there's a large amount of foot and vehicle traffic. The sergeant then posts a picture later on, 8th and Jack Street, of the crowd, and the captain writes, he'll let Unit 41 know in case we need staff. Unit 41 is the executive command support that is providing citywide review in case resources need to be redeployed. Later on at 10:37 is when indications that there are shootings over this thread that are mentioned. Next slide. In the early morning hours of July 2nd, there's a text message between the commander and Unit 41. Brooklyn Homes surprised us with their community party tonight. For now, I have a supervisor monitoring, and no resources are needed, but just wanted to give a heads up. Command acknowledges Thank you. We had no idea they planned this. At 10:32 a.m. to 1:19 a.m., 26 separate calls for service come in over the next hour for additional reports of shootings at the 800 block of Gretna Court. Next slide. At this point, we wanted to ensure that we did a fulsome analysis of all the different pieces of the puzzle.
Can we, I want to give folks an opportunity to ask a very straightforward and direct question just about the timeline of events. You mentioned that some of this information is being referred back to the Public Integrity Bureau. How many sworn officers have been referred to the Public Integrity Bureau based on our findings here?
So the information about our internal affairs process, I'm very careful about disclosing. We have made a number of them, but to define a number today might change later if they grow or if there's additional referrals that are required. That's subject to our internal affairs investigations process. The Compliance Bureau is not part of the Public Integrity Bureau. For those familiar, we're separate as an audit and inspections unit, and so as not to potentially harm or impact an internal affairs process, we're very careful about ensuring that there's separation. We have made those referrals in accordance with policy, but at this time, it would be not appropriate for us to reveal a number until all the investigations are completed and all members that are found accountable for their conduct during this event are held to account. And at that stage, when those are sustained or not sustained, that's information we can then share.
I appreciate that. And as a follow-up to the committee, would you be able to provide the personnel changes made as a result of the findings of this report to the committee? And I'd leave it up to you to determine at what point we've completed those changes, but.
Yeah, the only personnel change so far has been the reassignment of the major and the assignment of a new major. Anyone who's charged with an incident or a violation of a policy has to go through the internal process, and then that's part of the recommendation of the internal investigation. And then that could be part of the punishment if that's what they elect to do, but they have to continue the investigation, and they just got started. They didn't start their investigation until the Compliance Bureau finished theirs and turned over everything they had. Now they have to start interviews. And then I'm sure more stuff will come from the interviews that they start conducting.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions about the timeline that we've gone through so far? Councilwoman.
From the timeline of events, you mentioned the first call for service was around about 6:57. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. In your original presentation that you gave before the committee, I believe it was the first presentation, the first call for service was around about 11 o'clock, or 11 a.m.?
It was not tied to a call for service. So part of it is proactive efforts that we've engaged. And again, there's maps that we can show about our proactivity in the area. This was related to, and again, a highlight of one of the major calls for service that would have brought a person directly into vision of what was going on. So it's not to say that's the only piece, but it's the first indication where we could have had a sufficient look of proximity to the event, and that's why we highlighted it in this presentation. But the full outline of the entire timeline for benefit of the committee is outlined in the report, and it goes through the entire day's events. Again, this was an effort to highlight specific items that were of significant note.
Okay. And correct me if I'm wrong, did any officer or officers know about Brooklyn Day event prior to June 28th?
No one seemed to indicate there was any knowledge of it in the original submissions that were requested by the Compliance Bureau. To fully determine that answer, we have to go through our entire investigations process on the integrity side. Again, that's not my bureau's responsibility. It's bifurcated as a best practice. But again, we're continuing to listen and hear information, and if information comes to that light, we're happy to share what we can with the public that doesn't impinge or impugn upon our ability to hold members accountable for any potential policy violations in association with their conduct or behavior.
So is it true that your Office of Equity actually had a conversation with previous majors about Brooklyn Day?
Yes.
Okay. And so that gave you no indication about this event happening prior to June 28th?
One of the recommendations we have is about better continuity of transfer of knowledge between commanders. So There was a Brooklyn Day 2022 event. When I talk about prior knowledge of the event, I am referring to the 2023 event when its calendar date was, the preparations of it. That is what appears to have been a complete lapse of knowledge or situational awareness from our department. The knowledge of Brooklyn Day as a recurring event does exist within the department. We had no indication or does not yet appear to have had any indication. Again, we're still investigating. But that knowledge transfer wasn't sufficient.
Have
and
there
it
been
needed to
any,
be
have
better.
there been any officer turnover in the neighborhood unit from the past 2 years?
I have to check that information. I'm
Okay.
not too certain.
My line of questioning is if we have the same neighborhood, coordinated neighborhood police officers that served with previous majors
Yeah.
2 to 3 years ago, why didn't we have why didn't we have that continuity of process?
We are asking that exact same question, and those folks for whom are responsible for that and did not do their duty, we are, again, conducting internal affairs investigations to ensure that they are held to account if that sufficient information was available to them and they did not report it up in an appropriate fashion.
Ma'am, that's part of the interview process that Internal Affairs will do.
Yes.
They didn't interview, the Compliance Bureau doesn't interview any of our sworn officers.
Okay.
And that's Internal Affairs' job. So
Okay.
once they do that, they're going to figure out which order they want to interview based on the timelines and different things that were put in place and said. But, I mean, we knew all during the day that it was happening, so it was no excuse for us not to react to it. The
Okay.
First thing, even at 7 in the morning, a car stop or even driving through the area, there was enough cars that you knew Brooklyn Day was happening.
Okay. I'll save my questions for the next round.
Thank you, Councilmember.
Mr. President?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I guess when we go over the timeline, obviously these were critical points that you guys felt when you reviewed the entire timeline that should be on the slide today, right?
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that the only intelligence that was gathered was the one that was mentioned, was ultimately lost, was the social media post? Or is there other intelligence that BPD knew about pre, during, or post that is also germane to this topic today?
So based on the review that we've conducted in the Compliance Bureau, the information that we were able to ascertain, we found flyers in the neighborhood. We found some social media posts after the fact that were potentially generated on July 1st. One of the findings we'll get into is the fact that we didn't have personnel staffed on July 1st when the event was ongoing. But to your answer, yes, the only piece of information that we were able to find through our after-action efforts about intel being received in this fashion was the one that's outlined in the 28th of June. Again, the post was up, it was apparently deleted, and no follow-up action was taken, which again is something from which we are not satisfied with at all. We want to ensure that there is an appropriate follow-up process that should have been followed there, given the fact that there is a historical reoccurrence of this event and requires a great deal of resources, as it did in 2022 when we deployed in a significant way. That deployment plan is also part of our after-action review report found in the appendix of our report.
So I think it's important to just plant a flag that the only level of intelligence from the Baltimore Police Department about this very large gathering prior to was just one social media post that someone inside BPD saw and ultimately, I guess, walked away, left away, went to a meeting, came back, and it was gone. Is that accurate?
That appears to be the case what happened on June the 28th. Again, we're still trying to conduct direct interviews from which the Compliance Bureau is not responsible, but the Public Integrity Bureau will be responsible. But frankly, that's not satisfactory to us to wait to receive it off of the internet like that. We have a community engagement mission that needs to be better served in this respect. We should have expected our officers to reach out to the Brooklyn community and ask, not simply wait for the information to come to us. One of the recommendations and findings about this is about our over-reliance on formal structural relationships or the open source intel unit. That is simply not sufficient in this case. It did not serve us well, and it certainly did not serve the Brooklyn residents well at all.
And
Yes, well,
I would say that's not the only intelligence we had. We had 26 years of intelligence. I mean, we knew Brooklyn Day was going to happen. We knew it was going to happen on a Saturday, and we knew it was going to happen within a certain period of time. We didn't do our due diligence or what we should have done to find out if it was that Saturday or next Saturday or the previous Saturday. We should have had boots on the ground in the Brooklyn community asking, when's Brooklyn Day? When's Brooklyn Day? We relied too much on open source, which is a group of analysts who go through our social media, all the social medias, to pick up flyers that we pick up. But word of mouth within the community, they knew. There 900 people showed up, so us not knowing is not an excuse.
No, and I appreciate you accepting that, Acting Commissioner. I guess the concern is, you know, we have soft intelligence and we have hard intelligence, right? Clearly, there's a complete breakdown with the soft intelligence, and which concerns me as it relates to the consent decree. And I'm not really sure, Mr. Chair, where the monitoring team is part of this, but obviously, the citizens of Baltimore have put in and invested a lot of money in the Baltimore Police Department to move in a different direction through the monitor. And we're still running into these soft and lack of relational issues with BPD in the communities in which they serve. Some would argue certain communities that they serve that we did over the past, you know, couple of decades. So that's concerning. The other thing is the hard intelligence, right? The reality is there was much more than just one flyer that was put out there, one piece of communication that was done prior to this particular incident, and the fact that we didn't get it. Sticking down the intelligence line, I know that there was another bullet point in the timeline they talked about, and didn't say much in the report, that talked about communication between officers and text messages. How many devices were checked as it relates to communication back and forth associated with this day?
So part of our analysis was to ensure that we were looking at all formal means of communication, and that's the Evertel process. That's an app that's on their phones to be able to communicate. Moving into the text message thread, I made a decision about that, about how we do that process. Again, moving into that piece of the puzzle, all those departmentally issued phones are all, you know, within our ability to look through. But again, I have to be very careful about walking into the public integrity investigation space or potentially impacting those. Those text threads will be a part of the methodology for the Public Integrity Bureau. But in an effort to get the speed of this report done, to ensure that we had a comprehensive way, and to make sure that folks are following what's in the prescribed process of communication internally, that's the Evertel program. That is what's our system of record. And those text messages that you're describing, which would be person to person, will be part of the integrity investigation, not the compliance investigation.
So the text message that's described in this timeline is part of the Evertel? or
It was,
part of
no, the text message described there was volunteered by the, one of the members who.
So I think it's important to note that, right? Because today we're presenting to the public, we're presenting to this body that this important text message is part of this timeline. However, I think it's a completely different animal when you say this was a text message that was volunteered to be part of this report. Does that?
I understand, absolutely. And again, I want to make sure folks understand the limitations of what the Compliance Bureau could do, because if I move into the space that is the Public Integrity Bureau's space, I will potentially impact the ability to hold members accountable if they're not following policy, because I've gone down a path of investigation that could be outside of the due process rights of those for whom are part of this process.
And that is fair, but it's our responsibility and our job to ensure that we level set the expectations of the information that's inside of this report. And I think that there are a lot of concerns still with the report, and there may be reasons why. However, it's important for us to communicate information like
And
that.
if people have more text messages, and if they volunteer them, we will make that part of our efforts. And again, I want to make sure that that's something from which, you know, if there's information out there, we receive that and make sure it's part of the internal affairs investigation.
The last angle that I would like to go down, Mr. Chair, specific to the timeline, is about deployment. And there seems to be a huge question of where was BPD and at what time. I know that later on, and through your report and later on in your slides, you're going to get into, as it relates to patrol and the amount of personnel per shift and at what time. I think the bigger issue and the bigger concern that folks have is if a call went out, if a call went out at 9:41 p.m. that hundreds of males and females are armed with guns and knives from a location in, say, like Canton, Fells Point, Federal Hill, that the response would be different. And the problem I have with not only the report, but the problem that we're going to constantly see through your presentation today, which we need to speak to, and which is another reason why I'm really interested in the monitoring team and what we're doing with the consent decree, is why is that lack of equitable service to protect and serve the citizens of Baltimore different in Brooklyn than it would be in Canton? And I think until we're able to really be honest with ourselves, take a step back, and try to figure out and answer that question, that the reality of this occurring somewhere else, again, in 5 years or in 10 years, is the likelihood for it to occur, right? So, I just have a huge concern about all the effort, all the time, and I don't want to overshadow that there hasn't been a tremendous amount of effort, of improvement and work that's been done in BPD through Judge Bedard and through the monitoring team and through the consent decree. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I do think that this is a huge blow to the citizens and their integrity associated with what the consent decree has produced to the city of Baltimore to date. As it relates to the relationship, as it relates to whether it's implicit or explicit bias associated with certain communities and serving and protecting those communities. And that's what I see throughout this timeline, and that's what just really, really concerns me.
And Mr. President, I took that to heart when we talked about that at the first hearing, and we had our equity officer. She's going to give a part of the presentation as well. But we had officers available to move to Brooklyn had they been asked for. Just like we had officers available. We had over 100 officers still working at 941 that we could have moved anywhere. We could have moved to the western. We could have moved to the southwest. We could have moved to the northwest. But we have to have our supervisors within that district escalated up to our citywide commander, and they didn't do that. And the fact that they didn't do it is what's being investigated, because those supervisors were not new to the Southern District. They've been there for several years. They know what Brooklyn Day is, and they know what's involved in it, and they know what kind of response we have to keep it a safe party, and they didn't take that opportunity to ask for more people until they were getting ready to walk out the door on their shift. So those are some of the things, but when you brought that up at the first hearing, we made sure, and we're one of the few agencies that have an equity officer, and that's her continued task, is to look to make sure that this doesn't happen in another neighborhood. If we think it happened in Brooklyn, is it happening somewhere else that we have to address so that this doesn't happen again? And that's her main task, and she's going to talk a little bit more about that when she gets to her part of it. But I did take your inquiry seriously. I know I said I didn't think that was the case, but that doesn't mean what I think. The numbers is what speaks and tells us what the actions are. And in reference to the consent decree, the only part of the consent decree that we're not performing well is exactly what failed us here, the community policing part. And that's going to be my #1 priority if I'm confirmed, to make sure I bolster. I have several different plans for that, because community policing was my strong point in the Northeast and the Northern District when I was there, and it'll be my strong point as the commissioner. So those are the things that we're going to push forward, because that's the one part that we're lacking. And we have to take responsibility to that and fix it. And the mayor knows that we were lacking in that. The judge brings it up. He brought it up in the hearing that community policing part of our process failed us this day, and we got to fix it.
So I guess the question is from the council is, what is the monitoring team doing to ensure that we're moving that ball down the path? I mean, I think, obviously the consent decree and the issues was as a result of Freddie Gray. And when we look at Freddie Gray and we look at the lack of community relationship in West Baltimore, I can't assume that, or based off of all the data, based off of reading this report, it doesn't make me feel better that community relation has improved in communities like West Baltimore or like Brooklyn. And I think that's why we're here, that's why we're talking. The only thing other that I'm going to ask, Mr. Chair, and thank you for providing me the opportunity to speak at this time, the only thing I'm going to ask for the police department, and I was able to go through the equity part in the report, is a direct comparison of a couple timestamps of BPD presence in Brooklyn versus BPD presence in Fells Point. Because I think that is really, really important. I think it kind of speaks and goes directly to what could have been done, what should have been done, and it also speaks to the issue around equity and deployment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. President. Councilman Porter, was there a quick point you need to make? Councilman Torrance, I understand had a quick question, and we've got 2 questions down here. And Councilwoman Ramos. So Torrance, Ramos, Burnett, Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Chief and Acting Commissioner. So my question is similar to the Council President, because I'm wondering in terms of equity, have we done a deep dive into the district's general response outside of Brooklyn Day? I want to see that because I want to know how those officers have served that community generally throughout the entire year, not just a specific day. And then my direct question is, I knew about the staffing that was in your report and that there was no requirement that those officers stayed behind. But if I'm correct from remembering your plans for the holiday weekend, did you have either one of your platoons or both of your platoons of SWAT teams available at that time too?
I don't believe our SWAT team was on call that weekend. I don't know if they had a raid or whatever they have, but they're usually on call, but they're not out as an enforcement mode to respond to these type of things. It's mainly our district action teams, our patrol officers. We have a downtown deployment, and we could have held over the entire the entire Charlie shift for the city if we needed to, which was 100 officers. So we had plenty of resources to move wherever we needed because we knew anything could pop up over that holiday weekend. And we've dealt with it since COVID, and even after Brooklyn Day, we've dealt with pop-up events every single weekend that we issue cease and desist orders, or we have to move resources to deal with large crowds that are forming. And every other one we've done pretty well. This one, the reason we do well is it's communicated up to the duty officer or to the lieutenant colonels, and we can maneuver resources to different areas. This case was never asked for and nothing was ever moved there because outside of Brooklyn, outside of the Southern District, as far as we know now, and that may change as we do the internal investigations, nobody else knew Brooklyn Day was happening.
And again, part of what we found in 2022, looking back at the past year, in fact, the slide that's being shown right now demonstrates the question that you're asking. As part of our analysis, we wanted to ensure we understood how calls are being handled. You know, when folks ask for BPD's help, what is the disposition of those calls? And how is it compared against the rest of the Southern District? And what we find is that the overall dispositions demonstrate a difference between the average of what's going on in the Southern District. It could be a sign of officer indifference. We talk about that in our report. And when these things manifest themselves, we want to make sure there's an understanding of why and what's going on. This analysis that's being provided here is something we're looking at doing for the entire city. This is all of 2022 data. But in regards to redeployment of officers, 2022's Brooklyn Day plan, from which we did have sufficient situational awareness of the upcoming event, we held the Adam shift, the night shift. We told them to come in early 4 hours. We had the evening shift, which ends at 11, to stay late 4 hours. We redeployed officers from across the entire city. We redeployed DAT. We redeployed some of our special operations division that you've mentioned. All of that is provided in the report in the appendix in the 2022 Brooklyn Day plan. It is demonstrative of the kind of effort that we would expect and just simply did not occur in 2023. But it provided that level of support that Brooklyn needed to ensure that that event could go off without any incident, and it did. It was a failing on our part not to have that level of situational awareness. That instance, I think we got notice 3 or 4 days in advance of Brooklyn Day in 2022, and we're able to put together that plan that, again, is in the document that's before you. We did not get that level of situational awareness this time.
So I'm still troubled because this is going into a holiday weekend, right? Where there is heightened awareness for Homeland Security purposes. And that an incident where large crowds were around and that we are entering a holiday weekend when we are in heightened levels of Homeland Security because of the number of persons we have downtown, where was the urgency in, and I say that strategically, like this, I get the systems failure, but as an agency, there was an affirmative duty once you knew there was a large crowd to do the right thing in this instance. and we're going into a holiday weekend. So I'm coupling it's two-part, right? We're looking at the urgency that you have to have planning for a major holiday event happening, in addition to what happens on the weekends. And we know what our trend data at that time is for just general violence in the city. So where was the, and I get we made a change at leadership from in the actual district, but culture-wise, the agency should have been on a heightened alert, no matter what.
The agency was on heightened alert. Our criminal intel looks at everything that comes through for any kind of homeland security or any kind of event. So we are constantly, we're on heightened alert every single day, but because it's a holiday weekend, I get a report from our criminal intel agency that tells us what's going on, criminal intel unit that tells us what's going on. The fact that we had, and we were prepared, like I said, we had hundreds of officers. We could have moved anywhere in the city that we needed to, but somebody has to ask for those officers. And that's why we have commanders at the 9 districts. The captain or the lieutenant or the sergeants that were in the southern should have escalated this up to their chain of command and said we need more resources because Brooklyn Day is happening, and we could have shifted resources quite easily within, because Brooklyn's a little further away and it's out on close to the county. We could have shifted resources within 10 or 15 minutes. We could have had 30 or 40 officers converging on Brooklyn to form a command post and to form the ICS model to move in and just monitor or go into the crowd if we needed to. The fact that, again, no one escalated it up, and there's no excuse for it. We were prepared. They knew we had the resources. Everyone in the city gets a report that says how many people we have, and we prepare for July 4th weekend just like we prepare for all our holiday weekends that look thinking of worst case scenario.
It's my understanding that we're going to get into a lot of this discussion very soon. So, Councilman, if it's okay, I want them to actually get to some of that later on. I do want to get through this round of questioning, and then we'll come back. Councilwoman Ramos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll have a lot more questions on the equity portion. But just going into the summary and going back to the June 28th, when it was noticed on social media, it says here in the report and also in the slides that Patrol is asked by Intel to look for evidence of this. Yeah. And then that there's no indication of follow-up. So was that the commander asking the officers to look? I mean, you're very specific in the rest of the report except for right here. No. So I want to get a lot more specifics about what happened between the time that the analyst saw it, the time that somebody was asked to follow up, and then nada happened.
I can also tell you part of that is probably part of the Public Integrity Bureau because someone was told, and it was, they can talk about it a little bit more, but it's purposely vague because the person who was told has to tell us what they did and why they didn't do it. Someone in the Southern District was told.
So part of the challenge that we have in this particular instance is that the finding about the intel is coming from the intel officer, that they engaged Patrol to try to get a response and that there should have been coordination. The problem I have is that the Patrol side of it is not indicating who on that side was the recipient of that information. That's why it's all part of now of an internal affairs investigation to understand exactly the question you're asking, Councilman.
So has there been other instances like this in Southern District where somebody is told to do something and they don't do it?
I'm not sure how I can answer that, Councilmember.
I mean, this is crazy, you know?
It's unacceptable.
If there was, there's a blue team process that the supervisors, the same process we use here. If the officer is told to check something and they don't do their job, it's a blue team internal affairs process that the supervisor, and the same for the supervisors. Sergeants answer to lieutenants, lieutenants answer to the captain answers to the major, and that major answers to the lieutenant colonel. So anywhere along that chain of command, if their job is not done, then it's turned over to the Public Integrity Bureau for investigation.
And that's fine, and maybe that's done, you're sort of giving me the vague answer, but the fact is, we don't know who made the order, and we don't know who was supposed to do it, and we don't know why it didn't go back up to the chain of command, which is true for the rest of the incident as well. I mean, this is a critical time frame that we don't have any details on.
We're trying to get as much information through the internal affairs process. Again, if the Compliance Bureau breaches that process too far, it could impinge upon the department's ability to hold members accountable for things like neglect of duty, failure to supervise, or any other policy violations that are uncovered. So we have to be very careful from the Compliance Bureau side to go down that path.
Well, you understand where we're coming from, right?
Yes, absolutely, and we wanted to ensure that we brought as much information that we could come forward with to the public as soon as possible. But if we were waiting for all of the internal affairs investigations to fully complete, we would be months before we come before this body, and that was not acceptable to the commissioner or myself. We wanted to ensure this was done with all due speed and with all due transparency that we could give. We are not done. We are committed to this. We will hold members accountable who have not followed policy, and we are committed to that.
We know we know who was told in the Southern. Now we just got to find out who they told, and then basically go right through the chain. They told somebody, so internal now has to look at that because it could be administrative charges or policy violations.
Well, we do need to get into this issue of what the definition of indifference means, okay? Because,
that's what the equity-
and that, I'm sure we're going to get into under the equity report and some other things. But indifference indicates that it was, maybe we'll do it, maybe we won't. I don't think that's the case here. I think there was intentionality. And so my line of questioning next will be going into that. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilwoman. I want to follow up there. What is our protocol when dispatch attempted to dispatch shortly before the shooting, and we essentially got a no? How does that happen? What should happen in that instance, and does dispatch notify? Like, what happens?
Yeah, if they put out a call for a priority one and nobody answers, they have a board in front of them that tells them what everybody's doing.
Well, they got an answer, but they got a no.
No, I don't.
Again, part of it is ensuring that the officers or sergeants who are deployed to the calls for service are following their process and ascertaining through their judgment, through their discretion, whether or not the call requires police services. That's a daily part of the job. And so one of the call categories is no police service needed. Part of understanding the definition of indifference and whether or not there is a substantiation to that, be it real or perceived, was the analysis, the math that's before you here today, is understanding whether or not one community is receiving a certain type of police response in frequency versus another type of community. That's the basis of our equity assessment, to ensure that there needs to be follow-up done and better understanding, better training, and better realization of the impact that that has on the communities for whom are underserved. And so we wanted to ensure that that was done. The data that's before you is the 2022 calls for service volume. Again, it demonstrates that the post from which Brooklyn is located, had a different response compared to the average. More instances where they were coded as no police response needed, fewer reports being written. This is evidence potentially of indifference and a quantifiable way to understand the problem, right? It's difficult, council member, to really understand if it's intentionality. Again, part of that is through the internal affairs process, and we will do the best that we can to understand what's going on inside of the minds of some of our officers, of whom face huge challenges day to day in this role.
Can we go back one slide?
And
Yes.
really quick, though, the officer, when he says no police services needed, doesn't mean the officer said he's not going. That would happen.
arrive on scene to make that
What happens, the officer has to go to the scene. They have to call their 1023 on the scene, and then they determine, okay, this wasn't a police issue. And then that's the David no, which means no police services needed. It means it doesn't mean they refused to go. Now, that doesn't mean they went either, unless we track their.
And if we have evidence that demonstrates that they're not present and they're making that determination, that's a policy violation, that's neglect of duty, and that's, again, subject to internal affairs investigations processes.
Okay.
The slide that is the map is, I think, the one.
The
that
map, yes.
The council member wants to go to. So in basis of looking at the distribution of calls for service throughout the city, we wanted to understand what does our deployment strategy look like, when it comes to pre-positioned officers throughout Baltimore. And in looking at our review of this was analysis done as part of our redistricting effort. Brooklyn Homes is located in one of the most densely served parts of the city here, not served, but more calls for service are in that geography than anywhere else in the city, which is unacceptable when it comes to balancing the equity of our deployment strategy across the board. This has already been corrected, but as it happens, the post strategy for July 2nd wasn't updated until July 7th, right? We had moved into redistricting. That post is now, that geography is now well served by 3 posts, 3 pre-positioned officers. But as we go through this analysis, if you can go to the next slide, I wanted to show on the next slide, the other piece of equity here is understanding the difference between our proactivity and our pre-positioning and the business checks and foot patrols and the kinds of proactive efforts that aren't tied to calls for service.
Sure.
And
Before we go forward, I do want to give the other council members an opportunity. So I understand Councilman Costello, Burnett, and Cohen. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Please be brief with your question, just so they can.
Commissioner, who's doing the social media monitoring now? Is that sworn or civilian?
It's during civilian professional staff. There's some of both.
I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Both. There's some of both, but the majority of them are professional staffs, analysts.
All right, and have we increased the resources dedicated to that function since Brooklyn Day?
I believe we did, yes, and we're still trying to hire more.
Can we get is someone here able to provide a specific number of staff assigned to that function and compare it to pre-Brooklyn Day?
I don't have that with me, but I can tell you the one thing that did change are the hours. It's not acceptable for them not to have been working a weekend.
I would agree with you 100%. But there's got to be, we got like 15 white shirts in this room. There's got to be someone who can answer that question for me right now.
We'll work with it right now. I'll reach out to Director Campbell, who's in charge of that, and I'll get it from him. He's not here.
No one in this room knows the answer to that? Okay. Yeah, if you could follow up with me, appreciate that. A lot of the Commissioner, I appreciate that you're trying to take some accountability and responsibility here because your predecessor wouldn't have done that. But a lot of what I'm hearing is like the summer of 2018 when Department of Transportation and the former director.
Councilman, I want to be careful not to make statements about folks who aren't in the room, just as a matter of respect to them.
When the Department of Transportation tweaked the traffic signals downtown the weekend before 4th of July, and then we're shocked and surprised why traffic was a nightmare on the 4th of July. That's a lot of what I'm hearing right now, and it's frustrating. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilman Burnett.
Thank you. So I just want to second, that was actually the first question I was going to ask about the OSI unit not working. But the other thing I just want to lift up on that note is that there seems to be, and this applies not only to the Baltimore Police Department, but across city government, an over-reliance on community associations as the mechanism to garner information or to disseminate information to the community when, there's obviously a large variance in the people who are involved. In this instance, it sounds like there was a transition in leadership and folks didn't really know where to go. But oftentimes they may not necessarily be the best conduit. And so to lift that up and just as a statement for not just the police department, but every agency here, that everybody needs to be digging deeper into what it means to build relationships with community, and folks that meet once a month are great. That doesn't mean that they are sort of the best conduit for information. The other piece I wanted to pull out from this was that can you, I guess, just speak to, I know that you sort of alluded to it already, but there seems to be like a huge lapse in whether it's the flyer or information that was available on social media transition in both the commander in the Southwest District. Can you just speak to what protocols are being put in place to ensure that there's obviously there's information that's occurring, that's being shared within the department, but also we know for sure that Monzi had a presence there as well. So obviously they knew the event was happening and would have had a flyer. And so it's my understanding that there is supposed to be interagency communication happening. Can we speak to what current protocols and what we're going to be putting in place to ensure that, especially going into a holiday weekend, 4th of July, Labor Day, I mean, we know that there's going to be cookouts, we know that there's going to be large-scale events. What kind of huddles are in place to ensure that, but also when there's transition, that sort of additional accountability to make sure that we know what's going on?
When majors transition, we're coming up with, there's going to be a transition book that they're going to pass along. Basically, it's going to be a document of everything that happens in the district. I can tell you that wasn't the case here, but I can tell you that's not an excuse either, because it should have been known by the command. So, I mean, I'll just leave it at that, but there was no excuse for that, whether we gave them a transition book or not. Brooklyn Day was going to happen. It changes each year, but it changes within a 4 or 5 week period. So we could have done better with the transition document, but we still knew. I mean, it doesn't matter if we had a flyer on the 28th or if we found out at 9 o'clock at night. We still had time to move people there, and all those opportunities were missed.
Yeah, and part of it too, one of our recommendations is to do exactly what you're describing, is to develop a body of knowledge of every community within a district, and to make it the responsibility to have that be a living document that is referred back to, the kind of annual events, the kind of regular things that are happening in every one of the neighborhoods that are in a particular district. We want to actually make that part of our recommendations. We want to do that in partnership with MONSE, partnership with other agencies, partnership with the council as well, who knows about these incidents and knows about the ability to feed this information in. We want to make sure that we are where we're supposed to be. Again, that did not happen here. We want to make sure we want to be very fulsome about our ability to gather as much opportunity for the informal relationships to feed that information. Again, our equity director, Ms. Blyther, will come and speak to her methodology on this. That's part of the recommendations that she generated for this report as well.
And as a quick follow-up, Mr. Chair, on that, because I did see that in the report, that there were, that there's protocols in place. It specifically noted that that would be the responsibility of the Neighborhood Services Unit to compile that data and present, I guess, to their supervisor. My concern with that is, again, one, the police department and getting information from community can be a challenge. People don't always, even if they are a neighborhood services officer, people don't necessarily trust the police with this information. Two, so you may just not know. So it would be my recommendation that those reports also be viewed by MONSE and run by the council office, because this person is going to be judged sort of like, all right, their ability to compile where things are happening, but they may simply not know or have access. And so I would hate for that to be sort of siloed within the police department, knowing that, like, again, these types of incidents can occur again, and that institutional knowledge is helpful. But again, working with the council office, working with our state delegates, like just running it through the gamut that, hey, do we have this correct for this year, or any things that are missing along the way, and doing that on a reoccurring basis to ensure that, one, you're communicating with other stakeholders that represent your footprint, but two, that there was just maybe something that's missed. That's, somebody had to know this event was happening, and there's every one of our districts, there's sort of reoccurring things that maybe our office is familiar, or someone reached out to, hey, can you help me with the stage or something like that.
The BPD report confined its recommendations to BPD, but I think the CAO's recommendations broadly speak to that interagency coordination as well. And so again, we welcome that, and we want to ensure that we're reaching into every piece of information that's available to the city proper, not just to the BPD, but to the findings of the report, and the language in the report speaks to the BPD specifically. So.
Okay.
Councilman Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Eric, for your service to our city. And thank you, Commissioner, and all the agency folks that are here. Commissioner, I do appreciate you really, I think, trying to be out front and take ownership over what was a catastrophic failure within the department. However, one area that I felt fell short within this report was around the crime scene investigation. There's been reporting from the Banner and others that before evidence markers were placed, before forensic evidence could be collected, that the scene was cleaned, which intuitively seems out of order, knowing that we have a challenge when it comes to getting witnesses to come forward, and that often we need to rely on forensic evidence, on the what people touched that would be there. I think the report was pretty brief and kind of pushed back against the idea that the crime scene was not properly handled, but in reading it, in hearing about how that scene was handled, I'm concerned that some of the evidence that could have been available is not because of how the scene was handled in the aftermath. So could you speak directly to the crime scene and how the forensics team, how officers handled it in the aftermath of the most catastrophic mass shooting in our city's history?
Yeah, what happened is the crime scene was huge, as you're aware.
Yeah.
Our crime lab was there all night and part of the day. When everyone decided that they had collected as much evidence as they had seen and they also knew that there was probably some evidence that was buried under some of the debris, because it looked like, I mean, you saw the photos of it, it was debris everywhere. So what they did is they had some people come and manually move some of the trash to see if there was other issues or other data or other casings or anything that we thought was evidentiary value. And then we did find some more stuff once we started moving the trash around, and we came back and we collected those things. But the whole time that it was being done, it was our homicide detectives were on the scene, and our crime lab came back to collect any other data. But when we decided to move the trash around, all the data, all the evidence that we had, that we saw, we had collected over hundreds of casings. And that's how this case is being, that's how we've got the individuals that we've made arrests, is from ballistics evidence and different types of evidence. So the crime scene is a little vague because we're still investigating, and we'll continue to investigate this until we find every single person. But the report that we cleaned it up is correct. The report that we cleaned it up and missed evidence is incorrect. I don't know where they got the data. I mean, I don't know where they got the information for the report. But I can assure you that they looked at every piece of evidence they had before we started moving any trash around. They had collected it.
Yep. One thing I want to add is that the crime scene, having been at the crime scene in the early hours of the mass shooting, the crime scene is also the site of individuals' homes. And so that was also really important for us, is that we had to ensure proper ingress and egress of the residents of Brooklyn Homes. And of course, we attended or walked with residents to make sure that they could get in and out of their homes, but that was also a consideration for the department.
No, and I certainly can appreciate that. And I know that in the past, we have blocked access to residents' homes, and it has caused other challenges. However, I still think that preserving the integrity of the crime scene is critically important. And I would just say, Commissioner, that your reporting does not match what was out there in the media, which is that essentially cleaners came in and cleaned up the scene before evidence markers could come down. And so I just hope that that piece of this, as we move forward, is being taken really seriously, which is that in any, of course, catastrophic shooting, but in any shooting, to not preserve the crime scene or to in any way alter it, especially at a time where clearly in this case we struggle with the relationships between officers and residents, would just be completely unacceptable. And I do hope that that is being thoroughly looked into.
It is, and I can tell you, I mean, I can't control what the media writes or reports. What I can control is what my men and women have told us, and having been at the scene in Harlem when we basically occupied that area for 6 days and deprived people from going into their homes, that was not going to happen at Brooklyn Home. So we collected the data and the evidence as quickly as we could, and we allowed people, even while the crime scene was active, we were walking people to their homes so that they could get to their homes, because it was a huge crime scene. But again, I'm sure there's somebody who wants to have a story and they tell the media that we didn't do our crime scene correctly, but according to everyone, all my people that were there, every piece of evidence that we wanted, that we saw, was collected.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Melanson, you are welcome to continue.
Thank you. At this time, I wanted to bring up Director Blyther, who talk a little bit about our equity analysis. I'll do that in just a moment. But this demonstrates our proactivity strategy and how, frankly, it's insufficient over the last 3 years in the Brooklyn Homes area. We would anticipate that areas that have density of crime or calls for service would see a requisite deployment of proactivity to match in an effort to try to deter or prevent incidents from reoccurring. And so when looking again at whether or not we're serving the community appropriately, we wanted to make sure we try to do this on a data-driven way. And so this was another piece that's in our report that is just, again, unacceptable to us. We need to do better when it comes to delivery of service. Next slide. Okay, so Director, if you could do your presentation from there. So Director Blyther from the Equity Office, which is part of the Compliance Bureau, will speak about her methodology for that and answer any questions regarding the equity analysis. Director.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to extend first my sincerest condolences to the victims
Can you
of-
speak up? Just move the mic a little bit closer. That might help.
All right. Yes. Thank you. I'd like to extend my sincerest condolences to the victims of the harsh, terrible, unreasonable, horrendous violence on that day, and especially to the surviving families of those children, young people who were killed. My heart, like everyone else, goes out to you. My name is Leslie Parker Blyther. I'm the Director of Equity for the Baltimore City Police Department. My most significant role is to operationalize and institutionalize diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in the police department. Baltimore City Police Department is unique. It's that it is one of the few agencies in the country that has an equity office, and also we were among the first agencies in the city to identify an equity office. What is also unique about Baltimore City Police Department compared to its history is that DEIA stands for diversity, equity, equality, inclusion, accessibility, and anti-racism. And I would challenge anyone to look at any department with an equity office that includes such an comprehensive title. So today what I'd like to talk to you all about is the public's perception and what I meant by indifference, and also the relationships or the lack thereof of relationships that existed that may have contributed to the lack of knowledge. My specific role in this particular report was to gauge, to the greatest extent possible, given the time frame that I had, to gauge the relationship between the Southern District police officers, the command staff, and the citizens of Brooklyn. In so doing, I spoke to members of the Baltimore Police Department Executive Leadership Team, former and current Southern District command staff, district NCOs, faith-based leaders, nonprofit organization managers and members. I spoke to members of elected officials and executive from the Baltimore City Housing Authority. I spoke to several Brooklyn Day residents who were participants of, Brooklyn Homes who were participants of Brooklyn Day, one of which was a shooting victim. I also spoke to the acting executive director of MONSE, and I also took the liberty of speaking to Cure Violence in Chicago, as it was referenced at one time in a op-ed with regard to violence interrupters. So the first thing I'd like to talk to you is about the public perception of Baltimore City Police Department in the Southern District. Speaking to a number of individuals, it was condensed to simply that they felt that Baltimore City Police Department did not care, and they're speaking to their experiences within the Southern District. It was my language, and I chose the word indifference as I thought that it encompassed pretty much everything that the citizens were telling me. Indifference in my frame of work is less overt as racism. It reflects in things like microaggressions, subtle acts of exclusion. It could be more specific as being in an elevator and someone telling a racist joke and you not confronting them. Indifference also means, when we speak of racial indifference, we're talking about people who simply don't care, who are perhaps dispassionate, that they show apathy because of a person's race. And so after speaking to our Brooklyn residents, when they say they don't care, this is the word that we use in our frame of work, indifference. There were several comments that were made, which also show up in the report, that show microaggressions, such as, looks like they snuck Brooklyn Day in on us. Call in the National Guard, implying some type of military approach is needed at this time with this particular community. Anyone wants some overtime tonight. The checkbook is open, which reflects an insensitivity of what could be happening. The Baltimore City Police Department and the executive leadership team, and certainly Acting Commissioner Worley, recognizes that these are microaggressions and have spoke to these things. The next thing I would like to talk to you about is the relationships that I place in about 3 or 4 categories, I think. 5 categories. So we have what is called police presence, and of course there's this a belief by citizens that if police are present at a location, it will deter crime. We also have transactional associations, formal associations, informal engagement, and personal relationships. Our agency, like many law enforcement agencies, over-rely on formal relationships. That means, as you were saying, sir, that they look to nonprofit organizations to give them information, to share information. In this particular instance, when I spoke to people from Bay Brook Alliance, they were aware that Brooklyn Day occurred. They had never participated, and they knew nothing other than that. So as an example, to expect a nonprofit organization who has no direct contact with people who will create a Brooklyn Day is it's ineffective. So we have this over-reliance on these formal relationships and also transactional associations as well. I do also want to add that there were several other factors involved with regard to relationships. I did speak to a formal district commander. In total, I spoke to 3. The first 2 prior to the most current one on Brooklyn Day had a relationship with the Housing Authority's public safety coordinator. He also was a former police officer. And that lent to his ability to know, I think he said about 5 days prior to Brooklyn Day occurring, because of his relationship, his personal relationship with that individual. We changed command. There was no transitional process in place. And so his relationship with that individual was not shared to the next commander, although the next commander did have what I would call a transactional relationship with him. And he also was aware of Brooklyn Day 2 days in advance. That relationship in and of itself also was not communicated to the next commander. And unfortunately, by the time the next commander came in, the public safety coordinator of Brooklyn Homes was no longer there. There was also apparently an individual who helped coordinate Brooklyn Day. And unfortunately, my understanding was probably somewhere around 2021 or 2022, that person was no longer available, that they were deceased. And so these are the types of factors that you can't always quantify that may influence how people respond to a particular community, aside from things like implicit bias that is very difficult sometimes to quantify. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now that Mr. Chair is back in the room, I'll let him chair, but I have a few questions related to equity, but I'll save them for the next round of questioning. Thank you.
Please continue.
Mr. Chairman, we'll go through the remainder of our slide deck. Next slide. One of the concerns was about staffing and available staffing. This was another question we wanted to ensure had a comprehensive answer. Based on a review of the day of, or the day leading up to the incident, there was a full complement of staff that started every shift. I'll turn your attention to the center portion of this slide. The C shift, or the evening shift that goes from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., started with 17 officers, 3 sergeants, and no lieutenants. As the day went through, there were a number of folks who had to leave because they hit their overtime cap or they were drafted, which requires them to be released after the 4th hour. So we did achieve a full start of every shift, but we did deplete down when it came towards the end of those shifts. But, you know, coming into the night shift, there was a full complement. But again, the next slide shows staffing that was available, as the commissioner intoned, throughout the entire city that could have been redeployed at a moment's notice. That moment was never given notice to command. That is a key finding that we provided in our report. In addition, one of the things that would have been expected from the Charlie shift commander to have done would have been to hold the shift over. This is a common practice if there's a large incident or otherwise complex situation that should be done, but it was not. Instead, the Charlie shift commander released and relieved the shift, knowing that there was all those folks out there and not a lot of support from the Adams shift coming online. And so, again, the other key finding about staffing was the comment made about overtime being available. Instead of that, we would have expected or should have had the commander direct the shift to remain on after 11 p.m. when they were scheduled to depart. Next slide. Moving into the intel section, we've mentioned about the social media post being the only one found of the 28th. We also mentioned that there was no staff scheduled to work Saturday, which is unacceptable in a situation where, as Councilmember Torrance mentioned, large holiday weekend. We should have had some measure of deployment there. We are still looking into that issue in particular to determine who was authorized to leave. There was actually someone scheduled. We're trying to answer those questions in our follow-up review as well. There was not enough action from the Southern District. We are investigating that, and it was clear that there was a failure to properly inspect deployments on behalf of the supervisors. This is all part of our intel findings overall. Next slide. We did a review of the CAD records. These are a couple of maps. One's on the right, one's on the left are from the day shift. One on the right has to do with the evening shift. These are proactive efforts that are recorded by our officers who radio these in. They're not driven by calls for service, but instead when officers put themselves out on foot patrol or they do a business check or some other directed patrol, they give their location and that's recorded into the map. You'll see that on the evening shift at 5:27, 5:14, 5:43, there is more than sufficient proximity for our officers to have been given, in relation to where the Brooklyn Day events were ongoing. But again, based on our preliminary review and our information provided from our after action, no officer made that report up the chain about the large crowds gathering. Next slide. These are the calls for service generated by the public. Next slide. Sorry. No. These are the calls for service generated by the public. I'll point out again the map on the right, which has a series of blue dots that are in direct proximity to the incident location at 800 Gretna Court. Again, this demonstrates that there were sufficient calls for service and proactive engagements in direct proximity to the event's location. We should have had someone reported up the chain, and it just did not occur. We are investigating everyone who is involved in this, who were at these scenes, who were recorded as being responsible for each of these CAD incidents, and what their actions were. Those are all subject to the internal affairs process at this stage. Next slide. We did review radio traffic, internal communications. We listened to the entire day of radio traffic in the Southern District. And again, nothing over the radio that would demonstrate any knowledge or awareness or notification by officers or supervisors about the large gathering until well into the night, where we start seeing things at that 10:15 mark. I mentioned this earlier with the calls for service that were generated, but nothing about Brooklyn Day specifically. And again, the command should have directed not just to remain on the perimeter, but to have an active plan to be able to engage the crowd. There was no follow-up directive. Simply saying on the perimeter is not a sufficient directive in our mind. I think we wanted to see and demonstrate an action plan to help make sure that the crowd will be safely gathering. Next slide. Part of our review, we wanted to ensure we were reviewing body-worn camera and CCTV. The performance standards section within the Bureau reviewed 247 hours of CCTV camera footage, 8 hours of body-worn camera video, and 13 hours of recorded radio transmissions. I'll go through this very briefly in the interest of time. Next slide. These are some of the images that were captured overall from CCTV. Next slide. One of the key findings here, as I mentioned previously, was the fact that there were City Watch operators as late as 7:35 that seemed to manually operate the cameras and observe the crowd happening directly, and yet no notification was provided up. We are now looking at our SOPs regarding that kind of protocol to ensure that that doesn't happen again. But the first instance of City Watch notifying over the radio was at 10:15, indicating a large crowd size. That was done by a new person coming on shift at 10 p.m., observing the crowd and then making the notifications. We went back to review some body-worn camera footage of the supervisors to ascertain what their judgment was in clearing some of these calls. However, there's no body-worn camera video available from some of those members. Again, that's subject to internal affairs investigation now. Next slide. We spoke about the evidentiary piece of this as one of our key findings. We wanted to make sure that if there was an initial canvass done, that there was follow-up canvasses that were in fact done to capture all the appropriate evidentiary items, but that was done. Again, given the large size of the crowd and as the Chief Administrator mentioned, we have to ensure that there's appropriate ingress and egress. We don't want another Harlem Park, and that was a key factor in our ability to ensure that we're not simply locking out a community from their neighborhoods after a critical incident like this. There were a couple of positive key findings. We wanted to ensure folks understood that there was some demonstrably heroic action on the part of some of our officers arriving on scene. One instance from which we shared in our report was an instance of a member who effectively scooped up a victim and brought him to the hospital in his own patrol car, for which, given all the resources that were out there, was a tremendous effort. We have no doubt that if that did not occur, there could have been another fatal victim that night. And so that's something from which we are going to give recognition in our formal process. And BPD dispatchers did perform very well in this, ensuring that there was calm and real-time information given, proper coordination of resources. And so that requires, in our mind, some acknowledgement as well. Next slide. So we're going through our recommendations. Our first recommendation is to adhere to these new post geographies. I spoke about that map, about how inappropriate it is to have so much calls for service density into one geography. But we want to make sure that that's done correctly. We're going to adhere to those new post geographies and measure performance in those geographies as we do through our ComStat process, as we do every week, to ensure that there is an equitable distribution of proactive efforts and ensuring that we're creating better safety in our neighborhoods. We need to further enhance our recruitment efforts to bolster patrol staffing. Again, the issues of drafting that I mentioned previously consistently become an issue. They could be contributing to indifference. When the folks are overworked, it's not an acceptable reason, but it's something we want to contribute. If it could contribute to a person's posture of how they're feeling, morale generally, it's a factor that needs consideration. And so Commissioner is dedicating more resources to our recruitment efforts, as he's announced. He's doubling the budget for our advertisement efforts. And so that's a key factor that is going to be helpful. We're using state funds to do that. Next slide. Intel, we saw many different pieces here that needed enhancements. We want a better notification protocol. This not having a requirement to set it up, that's not acceptable. We want to be very clear about what those protocols are, especially in terms of large gatherings. We've already started this on the citywide level as well, ensuring that districts that are seeing these things happen, that their commands and their NCOs and their intel units are being communicative. We want to make sure that Evertel is being used appropriately throughout all districts. Not everybody uses the same program equally, and we need to make sure that they're using that in a way that's effective. There's some districts that do it better than others. We want to bring that best practice across the entire city. And we need to ensure that there are regular schedules covering the weekends for our intel and neighborhood units. This is a key factor that the Commissioner has already addressed in some of the administrative schedules that we plan on deploying next year. That includes weekend coverage with some of the major events. So this is something we've already achieved through our process. Next slide. Operational protocols, we wanted to ensure that folks know how to address a large crowd. Again, we want to make sure that guidance is given out directly and that there are processes to ensure that large-scale events can be safe and appropriately de-escalated when the hour becomes late. And then we want to make sure that there are protocols for evidence and crime scene management, addressing what the council member had said earlier. Those protocols help to ensure that there's coordination and proper management between forensics personnel, operations personnel, to make sure that there's any decision that could impact evidentiary value is made in coordination and not in silos. Next slide. This is a key factor that Councilman, you had mentioned about our ability to make sure that we're passing this knowledge into a living document. We spoke to BPD's requirements. Our commitment is to do this across all the different agencies to make sure that we've got a fully captured understanding of what's going on and what's expected to happen in our neighborhoods. And we plan to do this again in coordination with council members to help us do that effectively. Next slide. We need to practice more on ICS. We plan on partnering with the fire department on this, who does it very well. This includes tabletops, full-scale, and functional formats, but that helps us understand and be able to make sure that we're following protocols effectively. And we will prioritize the delivery of DEIA training for commanders throughout the department, in addition to all members receiving that refresher training on the equity policy during their next in-service training cycle. We have to speak to this indifference. We have to start somewhere. We're going to start here, but we're not going to finish. We want to make sure we keep following the threads on our equity analysis. We want to make sure that we are explaining to our officers why it's important to engage effectively, and to engage in partnership with our communities. Next slide. And it's a pro forma recommendation. We're making referrals. As I've said, we've already made referrals to the Public Integrity Bureau for further investigation of misconduct, and we will be making referrals to our Meritorious Service Board for those that receive special recognition, especially those engaged in life-saving efforts. That concludes BPD's portion of the presentation. Mr. Chairman, I would defer to you whether we want to pause here for questions of BPD or to take it over at the MONSE side for their presentation.
I know I certainly have questions specifically for BPD, and I'm guessing my colleagues do as well. I want to go through some of your recommendations. We're going to open up to questions before we continue on. The first recommendation you guys made was around staffing. The first two were around staffing. One was the redistricting, which we have largely completed. I know we still have some work to do around the posts. And then the other one was around enhancing recruiting efforts, which I can say we've been talking about that for a decade now. And I'm just not convinced that that is a realistic, I mean, certainly we should continue to do it, but I don't think it's going to be realistic to actually get more officers in. And it had me thinking a little bit about what other force multipliers we could look at. I know in the last hearing we talked a little bit about whether or not it made sense to, in certain circumstances, reach out to the Sheriff's Department to get some additional help, and if there would be perhaps a conversation there. Have we thought about that? Have we explored that at all?
Yeah, we're actually way beyond that. I mean, the sheriff and I talk all the time. For example, we couldn't cover the Locust Point festival this weekend because we had the 12-miler last weekend. We had the 12-miler, so the sheriff took care of that. And we get his help and it's not only the sheriff, it's school police has been helping us. 2 weeks ago, we had, I forget what, we had the cycling classic. I reached out to MDTA, who sent us, I think, 15 members. It makes it a lot easier when we say we'll pay your overtime, which we would have to pay our guys, our men and women anyway. So MDTA sent us people. I asked MTA. Maryland MSP didn't have the resources to send to us. University of Maryland, I'm going to reach out to them, but we're also going to touch For these events, we're going to touch the University of, Coppin State University has a police force. University of Maryland, Baltimore has one. Morgan has it, that we never used those officers before, but we're going to use them for some of these events. But some of the force multipliers that I'm looking at, and this is the main one that'll get us cops quicker than anything that we've done. In the last 2 years, we've had 184 officers leave the agency either through retirement or resignation. I tasked the recruitment unit to go back and look at all 184 of them to see how many of them we want to have back. I'm sure we won't want all 184, but those that we do want back, we're going to send them a letter and offer them a monetary incentive to come back. I'm going to hand sign every letter. I've already had a couple people reach out that want to come back. So things like those are going to get us officers fast, because even if we hired 500 cops today, they're not going to be on the street for a year. But yes, we are using all of our other resources, and the sheriff has been a great advocate. He's been a great partner. Honestly, I'd say probably over the last 8 months we've worked together, we've had more help from them, and we'll continue to do that. We talk almost not every day, but we see each other at different events, and when we need help, they ask us when I need help. And school police has been stepping up a little bit more too. So.
And with redistricting, the posts have been aligned, and we have implemented that. Again, as I mentioned, July 7th or July 9th was the implementation date, unfortunately about a week after this critical incident. So those posts have been developed.
Awesome, thank you. And we talked about sheriff. I noted and I think we asked this question in the last hearing, we didn't ask for any additional support from departments outside of the city. Should we have considered that?
We could. The problem is we have MOUs with those other departments and the federal agencies, but a lot of the departments outside of the city are having the same issues with staffing as we are. I spoke to Anne Arundel County Chief. I spoke to Baltimore County Chief, Howard County. I speak to all of them. The good thing is all of us have kind of come into command at the same time, and we know each other. So we can reach out and ask them, but it's tough for them to come into the city because, one, they have to abide by our policies when they come in, and our policies are usually a little more strict than some of the other agencies because we're overseen by the consent decree. So some of those things apply too. But we do have MOUs with them, and we have a mutual aid. In this case, Anne Arundel County was helping us in Brooklyn, so they will come over and we will work together if we need to.
Got it, great. And we're working on an agreement with the Sheriff's Department. Do we have any sense of timeline when we might expect to work that out?
What was that? I'm sorry.
We're talking about some sort of agreement or understanding with the Sheriff's Department in instances like this. Do we have a sense of the timeline for us to work that out?
I think it's already worked out. Like, I'll reach out to him and he provides us, I think we've got something coming up where he's providing 40 sheriffs. So if he has it, he puts out the overtime, and either way, we have to pay overtime, and we're going to have to pay, so we offer to pay for some of the overtime. And another thing that's coming up is that we're working on, we're trying to get ahead of it, is the Orioles. We're going to need some more help around there. So all those things, and then we got a really, really busy weekend coming up with Artscape, the Ravens.
So I guess my question here is we should understand the collaboration between BPD and the Sheriff's Office is case by case as needed, or do we have like a broad understanding under certain circumstances?
Well, I think the broad understanding is when you have a mutual aid agreement, you want to have a standing document that authorizes, as the Commissioner mentioned, a transference of budget for overtime and things like that.
Right.
That's something we're confecting, but ultimately it's something that historically is not going to be an issue that stops from the deployment occurring. It's the availability of resources that would inhibit that. And again, building out that relationship, as the Commissioner has mentioned, it's going to be as needed, but the standing agreement is so that if there is something that the BPD needs that they can help us service, that we are able to reimburse them for the overtime cost of doing so.
I think one of the main factors that you have to also take into consideration is not only with the Sheriff's Department, but also with our allied agencies in the counties is the willingness to do it, but trying to compile a contingent to come to Baltimore. How long will that take for them to get that contingent to come here to be useful? So that will have to be taken into consideration as well.
All right, I'll move on to my next question, and that's around recommendation 6, which was updating SOPs to ensure the safe and appropriate de-escalation of large events. And going through the timeline and reading the back and forth, it seemed to me that folks were indifferent, afraid. I know we're still working on what that might look like for our response here. Yeah. When might we expect to have a new policy regarding large events, how we deal with them before they turn into large events and once they are already large events?
Yeah, we've been working on the policy for large events for a while now. I think we're in the final stages of the draft where we need to be. I think, as you mentioned, clearly there were times when indifference was seen, or there was a lack of intelligence of proper NIMS, which is the National Information Management System, as far as ICS, of when to notify up the chain and how to notify up the chain. I believe that there, as the PIB investigation will show, individuals either for one reason or another did not act appropriately. We're addressing that. But what we do is in every interaction with our district commanders, there is a level of pushing that information up to the commanders that is expected of them, required of them. And as we've seen in this case, it was not done.
And in any case where we have policies that have to do with public interactions, there is a monitoring team component. Council President, you mentioned where is the monitoring team is. I did want to take an opportunity to say that through this PRB process, they have been observing our process, observing our report, ensuring that they have any questions that they could be brought in. But as far as the policy for this in particular, it is subject to their review, which we've been working on. We're putting the final touches on it, and honestly, I think we could probably do it before the end of this month to have it out there and distribute it.
That's good to hear. Would you please fashion that to the committee once that is complete?
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you.
And I've put forth a directive to be notified of any events permitted and non-permitted that we believe will have 50 individuals or more present. And so we've already started receiving reports from the agencies of those permitted and unpermitted events with 50 individuals or more. The other thing I want to note around special events, and I think I've previously noted it to this body, is that we actually have a weekly coordination meeting that I chair every single Wednesday. And I think on the June 28th, so prior to the Saturday of Brooklyn Day, we had a coordination event where we had BPD, MONSE, the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success, Rec and Parks, DOT, right, at least 7 to 10 city agencies where we talk through every single permitted event for that weekend, as well as unpermitted events that we are aware of. So that is our forum where we share intel. And so that protocol is already in place, and now we're just making it a mandate about notification of when there are 50 individuals or more.
Thank you. Councilwoman?
I'm actually going to yield my time to the council president.
Mr. President?
Thank you, Councilwoman. Just kind of quick and consistent with all the concerns I've had before, and just want to put on the record, I guess, my level of frustration at this point regarding the recommendations. I know this committee before has asked specifically for us to develop the operational procedure and protocol associated with large events. You know, I don't know if that's 25 people, 50 people, I don't know what best practices are there throughout the country. I don't know what we currently have, but, you know, to me, that's a clear recommendation that I would want it today and want it kind of in this report. And I know you guys are working around the clock to do that. I know the committee is going to hold you for that. But the reality is the rest of the recommendations, be it staffing, right? If staffing changed that night, outside of maybe personnel and their indifference or their implicit or explicit bias, this would have occurred from what I'm hearing, because we had enough staffing, we had sufficient staffing, not just in the district, not just throughout the city. If intelligence were there, you know, if the process and procedures of working with folks up the chain, of communicating certain things, of answering specific charges that were given out and doing them, that was all there for us to do. Like, that recommendation doesn't stop the mass shooting. If operational protocols were different, again, the inaction of the folks that were there, we could have 1,000 more different operational procedures and protocols in place. The likelihood of the shooting to occur and the inaction still would have. From a community perspective, having neighborhood summaries and understanding, knowing that what Brooklyn Day was and who started it and the history behind it and who's leading it, again, knowing that it was on this particular day, I'm not sure that anything would have occurred differently. And then policy and training. Again, we get to the last and final bullet. BPD will prioritize delivery of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility training for commanders throughout the department, in addition to all BPD members receiving refresher training on BPD equity policy during their next in-service training cycle. Until Baltimore City and this council and the administration and the Baltimore Police Department are serious about taking a step in the right direction of rooting out indifference, of rooting out implicit or explicit bias associated with certain communities, not even specific to race at times, but a lot associated with socioeconomics, then we will continue to chase our tails and go down this path of having these types of issues. Freddie Gray could have been killed in Brooklyn. The Brooklyn mass shooting could have happened in Gilmore. That is the reality, right? And I just get frustrated when we talk. We come up with these nice recommendations from systems perspective, from operational procedures perspectives, and we're not really talking about the root of the issue, right? And that's nothing that all of us can kind of change overnight. That's nothing that all of us have maybe the specific answers to do, but it's something that we need to talk about and be open and real about it. And I feel as if we have not done that. My question was not if we've been working with the monitoring team, you guys directly. We know you were in court, I think 2 weeks ago with Judge Bedard and the monitoring team. The question is for this council is, as we've continued to go down year after year and pay out from citizens' funds associated with the monitoring team with the consent decree, the main core competency of that was this community relation piece and angle. The reality is we cannot get ahead of crime in this city until we deal with that and address that. The community are our number one witnesses. They are our eyes, they are our ears, they are our literally intelligence. And until, again, we get ahead of that, we will constantly chase our tails around this particular issue. That is my concern. So the only thing that I'll continue to push on BPD, and I'll push on the administration, and I'll push on this council and this committee, is for us to come up with real recommendations that really go to the root of why this occurred. It wasn't because we didn't have enough people. It wasn't because we didn't have the right command. It wasn't because we didn't have the protocols or operational procedures in place to address this. It's because we decided to do nothing. And we allowed it to occur in Brooklyn, and we would not allow it to occur in Fells Point or in Canton or in other parts of our city. Again, this is not a race thing, but it's definitely partially a socioeconomic thing, and frankly, a mixture of the two. So I don't really have any other questions other than, and I'm not even gonna ask that. I just don't understand the real point of these recommendations, because this does not change what occurred in Brooklyn Day.
No, and I actually agree with you, sir. I agree with just about everything you said. The fact that these recommendations are what we didn't do in Brooklyn. All the indicators were there that Brooklyn Day was going to happen, and Brooklyn Day was happening. The supervisors just decided they weren't going to address them and they weren't going to act on them. And that's what will be held accountable. Now, I think we are on our way. And to answer the first question, we met with the mayor, CAO. The protocol is 50 people or more, but that could be lowered depending on where it's at. If it's 25 or it's 10, it doesn't matter. The number is 50. Anything 50 and above has to be escalated up. But if it's in an area where we see there's going to be issues or something that where we've had issues in the past, it should be escalated up. Brooklyn Day, the supervisors that were on the scene have been in the Southern long enough, they know what Brooklyn Day was. They just elected not to act on it. And I agree that we have to figure out why. And that's exactly why Director Blyther is here. That's her job, is to figure it out. And she started the process, but like you said, we're not going to fix it overnight. She's not going to be able to tell us exactly what's wrong overnight, but our goal is to fix it. And you're right, community policing is the part that we are failing in. It's the part that I'm going to emphasize, because my goal is to get us, if I'm confirmed, to get us out of the consent decree before I leave here, before I retire. So that's my goal. I want to turn the agency over to someone else that we've satisfied everything, every paragraph, and we're a much better department. We're on the way there, we just have a long way to go. But we've made a lot of progress in 4 years, but obviously this incident shows that we've got a good bit of progress to go.
The only other thing I would ask, if we could go back to the third findings from equity analysis slide, it was the 2 comparative heat maps.
A few more. Go one more.
Mr. President, while you're scrolling through, I'd like to share some observations from an equity perspective when the opportunity arises.
Okay, just a 1 second. So I think that, and I appreciate you, Mr. Commissioner, for hearing me in our private discussions, as well as in this committee's first hearing on this, and really tasking your team to go down and try to see. I could see the faces of folks around the room in many sectors of government that were uncomfortable of the path I was leading us down about my concern with Brooklyn, and I appreciate you going after and showing us and elevating this. You know, I don't know if there's a more important slide in this entire deck or that we're talking about other than this right here.
Yes.
Knowing that this area gets the largest amount of calls for service that one individual officer is supposed to handle. Right. Of itself, it's just an easy data point that we should be tracking, that we should be looking at, that should have clearly jumped out at us before July 1. Then when you look at the amount of attention that's applied to that same area, when you micro zoom in on the Brooklyn Homes area and you see that one little tiny dot by itself, couldn't be more clear as it relates to what we are trying to get at and what we're talking about. When you couple this data with the microaggressions that were talked about and some of the communication that came across, I think that directly tells us and leads us down the path of what we need to do to fix this, right? And until we start to, again, drill down on this and analyze this in a way that the city has never been comfortable in doing so, post Freddie Gray, and now post this Brooklyn shooting, mass shooting, until we're able to really do that is when we kind of start to develop some incremental change in the right direction of protecting and serving our citizens on an equitable and fair perspective. And I'll be open about this conversation. I had a conversation and someone said, well, it's the consent decree that made folks stop acting in certain communities or certain areas. Well, whether it was or whether it was not, folks didn't ask from being beat on, which came out in the federal report, and being treated, which came out in the federal report. They didn't ask to go from that to go from inactivity, right? What they asked for was equitable service. What they asked for is when I walk down the street, I'm treated the same way as someone else is walking down the street. What I asked for is that when 6 or 7 or 800 people are outside of my grandmother's house at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night, and we know that there's been calls for service for guns and knives, no matter if she lives in Canton or she lives in Brooklyn, that the same level of service is applied. What we ask for is when folks communicate to us, whether I get pulled over for a speeding ticket or a busted headlight, that I'm treated the same way. That is the police department that we're asking for. That is what the consent decree is supposed to occur. That has has not happened as it relates to this Brooklyn concern, and that's what the concern of this council and the concern of mine constantly share. So again, we can go over the recommendations about more police officers, about working with the sheriff, about working with other agencies, about more protocols, about more operation, but it's just noise until we change the culture associated with the interaction of Baltimore Police Department and the citizens of Baltimore. Again, this is not about race, this is about institutions. And the reality is institutions have been indifferent and provide implicit or explicit bias associated with certain communities based on their socioeconomics and their race, and that is the core of why we're here today and the core of what I think we need to do to drive sustainable change. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well said. Councilwoman Ramos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also have questions around the equity report, and I do appreciate that the police department, this was my request, so I appreciate that you did have an equity report. Did you work with the Office of Equity and Civil Rights on this report?
We consulted marginally with the Office of Equity and Civil Rights.
How many times did you talk with them?
I don't
I
remember.
think it was 3 or 4 different coordination meetings that Ms. Moore and I had. We wanted to ensure that we weren't overlapping our efforts. Our focus, again, was on BPD specifically, but there are other pieces that I know OECR is willing to speak to that they're here to speak to today.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, the big thing that I noticed I saw that was missing in the report was looking at not just the history of the data from 2022, but historically the treatment of residents in that area and how that impacts today, right? That's one particular piece of an equity assessment that is needed. I also didn't see, and maybe this is a personnel issue, the race and ethnicity of each of the officers that were serving that day. Now, that doesn't mean that, we generalize. It just means it's information to understand the context in which they are making decisions, right? The other piece that I saw didn't see, was the amount of time that each of the officers have spent in the district to understand their familiarity as well. And I did not see a recognition of the population, ethnicity, and race in Brooklyn Homes, right? We're just assuming all of this because we're in Baltimore City. But we need a very specific outline of these things to be able to understand, or at least have a better idea, or maybe not. But I think that there's a need to have a little bit more information about this because, Brooklyn Homes is majority Black. There's more Latinos now moving in. At least from what I understand, I don't have the details in front of me. Does that make a difference in this indifference that people felt like we don't care about our Black and Latino friends? That's the kind of thing that I think is actually going on here. And I would imagine that, and my colleagues at the Office of Equity might want to comment on whether or not that's what we need to have. I was just asking the Office of Equity to see if those are the things that would also be included in an equity assessment.
So, I'm sorry, did you want to respond?
Yes, we can include those in our own assessment. For the record, Dana Peterson Moore, City's Chief Equity Officer and Director of the Office of Equity and Civil Rights. We've begun our own equity assessment. We actually began the day after. We began actually the day of June 2nd. We were present at Brooklyn Homes that morning. We knew that Acting Director Mavronis was about just less than a week in her job, and we didn't think that she should be there alone. So we told her we were coming to help her. And we stayed for the week after. We talked to a number of residents. We were there to receive concerns and complaints. But we also began pulling data, looking at what is Brooklyn Homes, who is this community. What is the story of Brooklyn Homes? And so we have collected a lot of data. We're not yet ready to share it, but we've pulled maps and have some broad assessments of the community and who it is and what it is. We also went on the walk through the community. The overall, my own overall assessment is this is a very proud community. There are a lot of service requests. That says to me that this is a community that cares exquisitely about where they reside and where they live and how they live. But there's a lot more that we need to do. I pushed my button earlier because I wanted to share that one of the things that we really need, Mr. President, and I think he might have left, is there needs to be a move away from getting to know the community that you're policing to getting to know the community that you're protecting. And I think if there had been more of a protect focus on the night of this event, there might have been some different decisions that were made. But we've got work to do. We have a ways to go there. It would be helpful to have those demographics for the officers, but the caution is, white persons can show bias to persons that are non-white, but non-white persons can show bias towards non-whites as well.
And I was clear
So
about
really
making sure we're not generalizing, so yeah.
Right, no generalization, but what we really need to understand overall is we need to eliminate that as a factor in how we deliver all of our services across all of the city agencies, not just in policing, but certainly in fire, emergency, and what my office does. So there's a lot more that we can do, and we're happy to do it if asked.
Thank you. My second question is related to the NCOs. I have to say, I think I have the best NCOs in the city in the Northeast. How are the NCOs trained? Are they trained just by their major? Are they trained, by one? How does? Because not everybody is born an organizer. So sometimes you've got to, So anyway, yeah.
Yep. So through the academy and through our Youth and Community Division, there is a program of training that all NCOs go through. So whether they've been established or whether they're new to the unit via transfer, there is a process of explaining to them how the best practices are of them engaging in the community, like in Greater Baybrook, in Fayette Street Outreach, other places, in reference to how they're supposed to interact, what interactions looks like, either on the ground level for specifically the district and for the city in general.
Sure, okay. Well, I think that there's work to do there, right? I mean, and you've acknowledged that there's got to be a way that people not only understand not to just go into the traditional ways of doing things, but also, creating those opportunities for community, which is really important.
No, I think you're spot on. I think I've had conversations with my staff as well as my community or organization manager, that I just don't want NCOs or the Youth and Community Division checking boxes or doing busy work. What impact is the work that they're doing having on that community in general? So that's what I'm looking for out of this unit. We're looking at some revamping of some things in reference to the NCOs, their level of engagement. I know, either the Commissioners Basketball League, the Commissioners Flag Football League, Coffee with a Cop, the interactions that they have going inside of the schools. All of these things are cumulative, but we want to ensure that they're in the right areas where they need to be to have the greatest optimization and impact.
And part of the problem is that we've kind of reverted back to the way neighborhood services units were. Now they're called neighborhood coordination units. When we went to New York and brought this concept down, the idea was to make everyone a neighborhood coordination officer. So the idea was instead of the same 3 officers or 2 officers and sergeant going to the community meetings, the supervisors took the post officer. And you got to know the officer who worked in your community. You put a name to the face. The toughest thing is getting them there and realize it's actually not that bad to go stand in front of the community and speak to them, but it's just they just aren't used to doing it. So until we have that, relying on the same 2 or 3 people isn't going to work as well as if you have 15 officers that are willing, or even 10 that are willing to go into the community, get out and walk foot. And that's part of the thing that we've been pushing. I've been happy to get reports that they're starting to see our officers out on foot more. So those are the things. If you get out and walk foot, makes it a lot easier to go into a community meeting because you've already talked to some of the people. So if you get out there and start engaging the community, that's when we start breaking down the walls and the barriers between the police and the community. But I like that, the saying to protect the community instead of police the community. Because policing has gone from warrior to guardian. That's our job, and we're changing that mentality now. But we've got to get better with everybody being an NCO instead of just one sergeant and 2 officers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Before we go into further questions, I want to give the mother of Aaliyah Gonzalez an opportunity to speak. I had a chance to talk to her a couple of days ago, and really appreciate you coming here today. And I know this has got to be really hard to get through, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak your piece. And from what you've heard today, if you could press the button on the right-hand side, and that'll activate the microphone. You're welcome to speak.
Hello, everyone. I want to say thank you for inviting me and, allowing me to be here. This is not easy. It's not easy. I get so much stomach upset just thinking and talking about it. It's been my life for the last 2.5 months. I know you said we're guests of honor. This is no honor. I appreciate the sentiment, but there's a million things I'd rather do than be here and talk about this. So we all know what happened, the Brooklyn Days shooting. This is a phrase that will repeat in my head rent-free for the rest of my life. I just turned 40 in June. I had no idea the next 40 years of my life would look really, really different. I had no idea. So Brooklyn Day happens. I have no idea what this event is. My daughter, Aaliyah, she's been all over the news, and every time I see her pretty face on the TV, I'm like, she's not supposed to be there. Aaliyah has been an AB student her entire life. I've always gotten a report card that says, congratulations, you're on the honor roll. Every single time, there's not one time I didn't see that on her report card. Aaliyah was so respectful. She was very age appropriate, and I hope you all know what that means. She wasn't out there twerking and doing all the things that we see. Aaliyah had a curfew her entire life. Not until she turned 18 in April. April 12th is her birthday. But until she graduated high school, she had a curfew at 11. She graduated high school 3 weeks prior to the shooting. 3 weeks earlier, we watched our baby. My husband can't be in here. He's so anxious right now. We watched her walk across the stage at Maryland Live and receive her high school diploma, something she worked very hard for, and something that we were so proud to see. I threw her a graduation party. All the family came out. I made her put on her cap and gown for the people who couldn't make the graduation just so we could have pictures of her because we were so proud. Aaliyah would have never been out that late. But here's the thing, she earned it. She did everything her father and I ever asked her for, and then some. She wanted to celebrate her accomplishments. She wanted to go out and kick off the summer and have fun. Those kids wanted to have fun. Again, I had no idea about this block party, but I will tell you what a mother experienced that night. We got a call, Aaliyah's been shot. Alex, they're lying. Can't be Aaliyah, she was just here. As a matter of fact, before she left, I'll rewind a little bit. Aaliyah came in the house, and I heard her keys, so I met her in the hallway. I was sitting on my bed. And I met her in the hallway, and she just tilted her head to look at me. She said, "What's wrong, Mom?" And I said, nothing, baby. I'm just happy to see you, because I'm always happy to see her. She gave me a hug. We hugged each other. And I know now that was the Spirit telling me, go to her. Go to her. Later that night, she says, Mom, I'm getting ready to leave. I love you, and I'll see you later. I don't think this is what she meant when I saw her later that night. Aaliyah's been shot. No, she hasn't. Alex, not Aaliyah. Not Aaliyah. They're lying. There's somebody else. But Creed, they are calling from her phone. I get on the scene. There's police tape. There's so many ambulances out there. But they tell my husband and I that everyone's going to Harbor Hospital. We get in my car. We run to Harbor Hospital as fast as we possibly could get there, and there was so many people there, so many kids. It was so chaotic. And my husband's at the desk, the receptionist, and he says, Aaliyah Gonzalez, she has to be here. And he said, sir, she's not here. I said, listen, there's a lot of people, maybe you haven't registered her, but they told me she would be here, so she has to be here. She's not there. My husband calls Aaliyah's phone back, and they say, sir, your daughter is still here at 807 Gretna Court. She's dead. She's still lying here on the ground. So we run back over from Harbor Hospital to 807 Gretna Court, and at this time, I'm not stopping for nobody. I'm pushing through people. I'm pushing through police officers. I've got to get to her. I've got to get to her. They told me she's here. And if I can, I would like to play a video from that night. I'm not sure if you can see, but you can certainly hear what I've experienced that night.
Damn, yo. Damn, bro, that's her daughter. Oh, my God. Oh, my God, yeah. Oh, my God. Damn, yo.
That video, I hated that video. It got to my son. Before I could even call him, it was already on the internet. And I hated every part of that video. It shows my daughter laying on the stairs with a white sheet over her, and me knowing that was her because she would have called me a long time ago. She called me. She texts me 50,000 times a day. I didn't hear from her. I know that's her. And most of you, I don't know, I know some of you were on the scene with me. And see, what you don't know, I said, thank you very much. What you don't know is what grief does, because I can hear what you're saying, but I don't understand what you're saying. My daughter was just with me hours ago, and she's not dead. She's waiting for me to help her. She doesn't know you. Just let me get to her. See, that's what grief does. It makes you play these things that you know are not true or not reasonable. But she's waiting for me. So move, please. Let me get to her. I got on the scene. The police told me. We just found out about it today. Immediately, I said, Alex, they're lying. Someone told us that we just found out about the Brooklyn Day block party today. I stayed on the scene. My husband and I could not leave. And I stayed there, and I wondered why was she laying there so long on the stairs. Her back is on concrete. Would you please move her? It must hurt her to lay like that. That's not comfortable for her. And again, I know what I see. I'm a logical person. But a mother does not understand that. So now I wait for coroner to get there. And you want to put her in a bag. Why would you put my beautiful baby in a bag? She can't breathe in there. Knowing that there were calls, endless calls for help, and no one showed up. Knowing that Foxtrot, I now know the name, a helicopter who's hundreds of feet in the air, will tell you as they look down from hundreds of feet in the air that everything looks normal. What's your normal? I challenge you, what is your normal? Let them take each other out. Is that your normal? That's what happened. I can never, ever, ever have the only thing that I want back. I never thought in a million years I'd have to walk without her. I go on a lot of walks. Sometimes I have to hug myself to imagine her hugging me back. Sometimes I have to reach my hand out to imagine I'm holding her hand while I'm walking. This is my life. And people did not care enough to check on them, to check on her. It's not right. So I'm forced to adjust and I'm forced to live with this for the rest of my life. I've returned back to work just last week, and it's been a challenge. Everything is a challenge. My son, he misses her. People don't know my girls are a year apart. Michaela's 17, Aaliyah's 18. They shared a room their entire life. Can you tell your sister? Aaliyah played the big sister very well. Mickey played the little sister very well. She's used to hiding under the cover of her sister. She is being forced now to be alone. To be alone, and it's so hard for her. You guys don't know. I have to make sure grief counseling is in place for them at school. She walks around and she feels like everybody's staring at her and they know she can't have a regular life. This is her senior year of high school. This did not have to happen. This didn't have to happen if there were 1 or 2 or 3 patrol cars out there. I'm sorry, guys. As I said, this is my life. I thank you for letting me speak today.
Thank you. We're going to take a 5-minute recess. All right, we're going to bring it back to order. That was a lot. It's very hard to hear. I think in the everyday conversation that we have here, it's not often that we get to see in front of our eyes firsthand the impact that it has on families, on people, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers. Literally every single person in this room was moved, and I don't feel comfortable continuing to have this conversation, not right now. We're gonna go into recess. We're gonna bring everybody back. We still have work to sort out. I do appreciate the department, commissioner, the work that you guys have put into this report. I think it's important, it's honest, straightforward. I think there are deeper conversations, as the president has alluded to, about what's going on with the department and its relationship with certain neighborhoods. That said, you know, this work, this hearing, what we learned from this, it's real. It's real people and real families and children. We have to get this right. I know we all take this work very seriously. But as parents, as citizens and residents, as public servants, we all know why we do this work. We're not here for the paycheck. We're not here for any other reason as to improve our city, to make things better, to leave things a little bit better than when we got here. So my charge to the folks in this room, take that, digest it. Appreciate how important our responsibility is. We have a lot of power right here in this room to fix exactly these issues, and it takes honesty. It takes transparency, which I appreciate, Commissioner, you have done. But we need to get this right. So we have more work to do. We're going to go into recess, and I will see you guys when we announce the next hearing. Thank you.